Welcome to the Historical Romance Sampler Podcast, the place for you to find new historical romance books and authors to fan over. I'm award-winning historical romance author Katherine Grant, and each week I'm inviting fellow authors to come on and share a little bit of their work and themselves. They'll read a sample of one of their books, and then I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions. By the end of the episode, you'll have a sense of what they write and who they are. Hopefully, you and I both will have something new to read. So what are we waiting for? Let's get into this week's episode.
All right, today I am joined by Matilda Madison from the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. A history lover, Matilda finds immense joy in knowing useless facts, exploring the woods around her home, and drinking copious amounts of tea. When she's not writing, she can be found researching obscure topics for her books, refurbishing old furniture, and baking bread. Matilda, I'm so glad to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah. So I know you're reading from your book that's coming out June 11th, A Duke Makes a Deal. What can you tell us about the book and about the scene that you're going to read?
So The Duke Makes a Deal is the first book in my Gambling Peers series. It's a new series. There's 3 books, and each of my heroes deals with a mental health aspect. So
Okay.
the Duke, Silas, has an anxiety issue, but because of the time period, it's not really understood, but he gets panic attacks, essentially. And in the scene, he's second guessing going out into a crowd, and our heroine Clara is able to kind of walk him through it. And because of the time period, there wasn't a lot of information on panic attacks or anything like that, so it's a little uneasy, but I've dealt with panic attacks before, so I was able to pull from experience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear the excerpt and then talk to you more about that because I have some questions already. All right, take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Silas wasn't sure if he should have explained his problem to Clara before agreeing to escort her on a walk through Hyde Park. What had seemed like a completely plausible idea yesterday now seemed impossible. For whatever reason, being in Clara's presence had given him a false sense of security, and he had foolishly believed he could handle the crowds of Hyde Park when she had suggested a walk. He was never going to get through the next hour, let alone manage to keep his composure under the curious eyes of the ton. He stuck his fingers into his vest pocket and fished out a watch as he waited in the Woodvine foyer, 10:15. He had purposely come early before the fashionable hour so he could avoid the largest of the crowds. Perhaps Clara wouldn't mind if he had remained quiet during their outing. He would need to concentrate on his breathing to stop himself from experiencing the panic that often settled in when he was in public. Just then, voices sounded from the top of the stairs. Turning, he saw Clara, dressed in an overly embellished maroon and cream-striped walking gown, followed by her mother, who wore a similar style dress. Who in the world was their seamstress, he wondered as his face remained blank upon their descent. Your Grace, Mrs. Woodvine said, coming up to him. We are so grateful to be in your company this morning. The pleasure is all mine, he said, his eyes fixed on Clara. Shall we? Yes, the ladies said in unison as they moved around him. They were out of the house and into the carriage in a matter of minutes. Silas tried to make small talk with the mother, but the closer they got to the park, the warmer his body became. His clothing seemed stifling and too tight. He thought absently as his gaze drifted out the window. Good Lord, why were there so many people here? The sidewalks and roads seemed to be overrun with bodies. Did people really come together at the exact same time each day simply to gossip? Your Grace? He said, turning back to his companions. The mother had an expectant expression on her face, while Clara tilted her head, her eyes seemingly going right through him. He shook his head. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Woodvine? I was wondering if you were attending the races next week, she asked, evidently repeating herself. Mr. Woodvine and I had never actually been, and we had planned on going until, well, Mrs. Woodvine glanced at her daughter, and Silas saw Clara blush with displeasure. She means until I caused a scene, Clara said honestly. That's not what I meant, dear, her mother said. It's quite all right, mother. His Grace happens to be on our side. Her eyes flickered to Silas's face. Aren't you? I am, he said, his tone deep and honest, before turning to face Mrs. Woodvine. I actually don't believe a word of what was written about Miss Woodvine. The older woman sighed with reprieve. Well, that is a relief, she said, her shoulders dropping a fraction as she watched her daughter. I don't know why they wrote those lies. I mean, Clara did speak somewhat loudly, but she certainly didn't scream, and no one fainted. Thank you, Mother, Clara said, slightly embarrassed. The corner of Silas's mouth turned up at her discomfort. Evidently, she wasn't as calm and collected as she often appeared. Turning to peer back out the window, Silas's good humor vanished as the carriage came to a stop. The door was opened by the footman, and when Silas didn't move to exit, he felt the Woodvine's eyes on him. Silas, Clara whispered, low enough that her mother couldn't hear, but it seemed to echo in his ears. He watched her steadfast eyes, and he felt the erratic speed of his heartbeat begin to slow. Clearing his throat, he shook his head and climbed out of the carriage. He did not turn around, though he was sure a number of people were watching him as he waited, first to help Mrs. Woodvine out of the carriage, and then Clara. When they were all out, he took a deep breath and offered his arm to Clara. She slowly slid her gloved hand into the crook of his arm, and they turned to follow the wide stretch of path that led into the overcrowded park. Silas felt his mouth dry as he kept his eyes on the tree line. His legs felt stiff and gel-like at the same time, and he knew he would soon be awash with the terror that gripped him every time he came out in public. Only this time, as he felt himself trying to float away to internal panic, the small warm grip of Clara's hand held onto him. Are you all right? She whispered, leaning ever so slightly towards him as they walked. Yes, he said gruffly. Are you quite sure? You seem unwell. Unwell was an understatement. He felt as if a stone was pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. I'm fine. It would be all right if you were unwell, she continued as his panic began to melt into irritation. I would understand it if you wished to turn back. We're not turning back, he bit out in a harsh whisper. Hopefully his tone had scared her off from asking whatever. I wonder if you're coming down with something, she continued. He looked at her out of the corner of his eyes and noticed that she was facing straight ahead. His eyes darted around them, and he realized that nearly everyone they had passed was staring at them, all while Clara prattled off about illnesses. Was she worried about him? Surely not. And yet he wondered if he could tell her about his damned anxiety. Would she be understanding, or would she politely smile and nod at his confession while plodding away to escape their arrangement? He turned his head and listened as she tensely chattered about this and that. His own anxiety seemed to dim as he gently squeezed his arm around her hand. You're nervous, he said lowly, and as he bent down to her ear. Clara turned to face him, her bright, clear eyes catching his as he felt a drop in his stomach. What was the matter with him? If I admit I am, will you tell me what's wrong? He didn't wish to tell her, but then something in her steady gaze gave him confidence. He exhaled slowly as they walked. I have an issue being out in crowds like this, he said so quietly he doubted she could hear him over the conversations around them. He bit his tongue before continuing, suddenly bitter by his own weaknesses. It makes me uncomfortable. When Clara didn't answer, he was sure she believed he was some kind of pitiful fool. How could a man of his size be made to feel uncomfortable in crowds? Her fingers squeezed against his bicep, and he felt the strangest of surges go through him. It was a small reassurance, he knew, but it had surprised him. Is that why you've not attended anything for the past year? She asked quietly. Yes, he answered. She was quiet for a moment before turning her face to him. Well, if you stay close to me, I'll keep you safe. Silas let out a gentle huff of laughter. What a ridiculous thing to say. She was shorter than him, and while he did not think she was weak, the differences in their physical power were evident. It was preposterous to think that this woman could keep him safe from anything, and so he laughed, but Clara did not. His brow creased. You're serious, very much so. And how would you be able to keep me safe? Distraction, she said, as they slowed their steps, coming to a particular crowded section of the Christian path. If you feel weary about crowds, you might only focus on me, and in doing so, forget that there are people around. And you think that would work? It's working now, isn't it? She asked. Silas wasn't able to argue with her. The misery he had felt along their ride to the park had subdued the moment she touched his arm. Maybe she was onto something. I suppose I should keep you near me then. Clara smiled at him, but seemed oblivious to his meaning. I wouldn't mind, she said, but if you're ever not close by and you find yourself experiencing the same feeling, remember that it will pass. Let it be, he scoffed. Easy for you to say. You've obviously never experienced it. No, she admitted, but a friend of mine's mother was a nervous sort of woman. Silas glared down at her and she blanched. Not that I'm calling you nervous or a woman. Clara bit her lip, obviously worried that she had offended him. Silas breathed deeply. This woman, he said, ignoring her apology. Who was she? Clara smiled wistfully. My dear friend Holly Smith's mother, Lady Smith. Perhaps you knew her? She passed away about 5 years ago now, but I remember her quite well. She was always very kind to me. Silas shook his head. I do not know her, no. Oh, Clara said, her shoulders dropping a bit. Well, she was a fine lady, but she often suffered a certain sort of attack, as she put it. Sometimes, when it would happen, her face would become drawn and her eyes appear distant. I remember she would experience them from time to time when I visited. Her eyes would close and she would breathe deeply for several moments before regaining herself. When I asked if she was all right, she told me that she often experienced a terrible bout of anxiety and that she had suffered for many years. Silas was skeptical but curious. And she closed her eyes to dissuade it, he asked unbelievingly. No, not exactly. When I asked her if closing her eyes helped, she told me that once when she was caring for Holly's younger siblings, their twins, not long after their birth, she had felt the beginning of one of her bouts. But she had been rather busy. Well, dreadfully busy from what she explained. The twins had been crying nonstop and the entire household staff had come down with a sickness. And she had been so tired from the demanding workload that she felt it coming on. She got angry. Angry. Yes, apparently she'd been so upset that she decided to drop everything and let the bout happen in an effort to be done with it as soon as possible so she can go back to work. But the moment she decided to let it happen, it faded away. Silas's feet slowed. It faded away. Yes, you're not serious. I am, Clara said. That's what she told me, and that ever since that day, instead of dreading or fighting the feeling, she simply let it be. She would wait for it to come, accept it. But she said that they were never as bad as they had been before that day, but she still suffered from them. I suppose, but she said it was never as bad as it once had been after that, Clara said. Silas wondered if such a thing were possible. It seemed the opposite of what he wanted to do. When the choking anxiety would fester in his chest, he wanted to beat it down, to strangle it away. To simply let it wash over him sounded like poor advice, but then he hadn't been able to find any doctor that can explain to him what he was experiencing, nor did he know how to stop it. He turned his head and watched Clara's profile as they continued their walk, rather in awe of this person who would have such information, and he wondered what else he might learn from her.
A nice scene to read because, it's obviously a moment of vulnerability, but we don't often have the scenes be about something so very vulnerable.
Mhm.
I have more questions for you. Well, I have questions for you. First, we're going to take a break for our sponsors.
Hey samplers, it's Katherine Grant. I am interrupting this episode to tell you how to get a free book, The Viscount Without Virtue. First, go to bit.ly/HRSFAN. Go through the checkout process. This is where you add the promo code HRSFAN. As your last step, just download your free ebook to your e-reader. All right, well, let's get back to this week's episode.
All right, we are back with Matilda Madison, who just read a sample of A Duke Makes a Deal, which comes out June 11th. And it was a really interesting scene because you set it up that all your heroes in this series deal with some mental health challenges. And the hero in this scene is having a panic attack, and the heroine helps him calm down, which is such a beautiful example of the partnership that they might have if they figure out how to get together. So I'm curious, in terms of mental health, it's easy to understand that humans have been experiencing things like panic attacks the entire time that we've been humans, but it also is such like a modern term, and our framework for understanding it, at least in the West, really didn't start until decades after the Regency period. So how do you approach mental health, knowing that you have modern readers who will understand the modern framework, but historical characters?
So in this, well, because my hero is a duke, so he's the most powerful of his spot in time and place. So, but men experience mental health just as much as women. But you're right, these humans have been having anxiety attacks and panic attacks since the beginning of time. And so there would be like a communal, like, I'm sure back in the day, like, oh, that woman's hysterical was what it was called, but it didn't negate like how to get through it. Like the friend's mother in the scene, she used to have panic attacks, and there were people around her who witnessed it, who talked to her about it, store that information. When she meets the Duke who has the same thing, she's like, oh, I heard once upon a time about a woman who had the same thing. And instead of leaning into the gender roles back then, because I really don't know if men were ever diagnosed with hysteria as
Mm-hmm.
women were, but I know for a fact men have panic attacks. So it it was there. I don't know how much it was talked about, but I'm sure there was a common thread throughout society that was, oh, this is a situation some people experience. So
Mm-hmm.
just, replaying information and my heroine Clara being so open about it because she's never experienced it. But yeah, she talks about it, and that's a bit of me. So
Yeah. Did you choose to make your heroes the ones who were having mental health challenges explicitly because there's this historic gender dynamic where we think of women as being hysterical?
yes, I know just in my experience of my own life that the men in my life, I mean, men and women, everybody experiences mental health issues. And I personally know men who go through it, but it seems more difficult for them to find a community, to find friends, to talk about it openly. So I wanted to write a series of books where, because my three heroes in this series are also friends, and even they're uncomfortable talking about it with each other, which is very much how the men in my life react. So, but I wanted to explain it that men have problems, and that's okay. If
Yeah.
you go through it, if you search for help, if you do as best you can, you can. It's something that we can all work on, and regardless of gender and stuff. So.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think about the alpha hero stereotype sometimes as where we're writing towards the man who is not allowed to have emotions, and then love is an emotion. And so when he starts to experience love, some other emotions come out. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's kind of cathartic to read alpha heroes sometimes, because you
Mhm.
start with like this man who refuses to admit emotions and he's so strong. And then like by the end of the book, it's like, oh no, he has a heart. I think the way that you're approaching it is another very interesting and necessary way to say, well, they have emotions, but also there's more to it. Like men have a full spectrum. Sometimes I feel alpha heroes are just like not a real man. they're
Yeah,
just they're
but
just
they're.
like symbolizing something else. So I
Mhm.
think that's really interesting that you have explicitly set out to do this. Now, did you do any research? Have you found any interesting stories or anecdotes of people in the period who, wrote in their diaries or anything about experiencing mental health?
I did some research on trying to like find like the history of anxiety and depression disorders, and I think I got back to the mid 1700s. France philosophers were just opening up about it, like just trying to. They, I don't have my research with me, but they had different names for it. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
sound very nice. I'm sure it was nice at the time period for somebody to read a French manuscript and be like, "Oh, I also have whatever they called it, like terrible disease or something." Like they had terrible names for it.
Yeah.
But it was at least a step towards modern diagnosis for mental maladies and stuff like that. Because I mean, depression has gone on since the beginning of time. So obviously, ancient Greeks talked about it, but it was like mid 17th century is when they had a resurgence or an interest in how the mind works. So
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of incorrect things that they had to get through before we
that's
get to
why it's
modern.
a practice, not a
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And this might be too personal a question, so feel free to say it's too personal. But you mentioned you've experienced panic attacks as well. I'm curious, how do romance books, do they at all fit into your mental health care for yourself?
Absolutely. I'm very open about my mental health. I talk to anybody who will listen about it because I grew up in a house that was very much like talk about your feelings and you'll feel better. So I've just always done it. And so I've had tons of therapists and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, romances, particularly historical romances, have always been a self-care situation for me. I read them to remove myself from any current situation, whatever my stresses are in current life. And I don't have to be me in that moment. I could be someone else in a different time period and experience something so far removed from my reality. So in writing them and reading them, and especially writing them, I mean, I started writing years ago as a form of therapy to get my emotions out. And when things didn't go my way in real life, I would be like, well, I'm going to write a story where everything goes exactly how I want it. And it's probably some kind of like control issue. but they help me, they make me feel better at the end of the day. And I love them so much.
Yeah, I relate to that so much. However, I've also found that publishing my writing creates all sorts of new mental health hurdles.
So
Keeps my
much every
therapist
single time.
employed. Do you have any good frameworks or mantras for keeping yourself grounded when it's, the throes of publishing and it hurts?
So yes, I had a day like that yesterday. Actually, I had expected something, didn't go my way, and I let myself, from the minute I found out to probably like 4 hours, to be an absolute grump. I was miserable. I was like, oh, I'm the worst. I don't care. I played, what was that song? It's The Climb by Miley Cyrus.
Yeah.
And like on repeat. And I was like, I'm the worst. And then after 4 hours, I only allow myself 4 hours. And then at the end of 4 hours, I'm like, okay, stop. I wrote out 4 new book proposals. I shot some ideas. I called a friend. I went through plot points and stuff like that. And I just continued my work. But I did allow myself to be annoyed and sad and mad and grieved because you can't not. You
Yeah.
need to experience all of your emotions. So I allow myself it, but I never go past a 4 hour mark. And rarely it goes all 4 hours, maybe like an hour. I'll be sad and then I figure it out. But yesterday I was a little annoyed, so I let myself the whole 4 hours. But
Yeah.
but
That's,
and back on work today, like just I
yeah.
have word counts to get through and ideas to send out and stuff like that. So I'm not allowed to grieve for like a week or anything like that. That's too much time. So I allow
Yeah.
it, but not too much.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a good strategy. I've been having a bad morning where I just couldn't motivate and I was having all these external voices in my head and I just knew I wasn't going to be able to be productive if I was writing. So instead, and normally I write in the mornings, but instead of forcing myself to do that, I said, I'm going to get other stuff done this morning and then maybe this afternoon I'll feel up to it.
Yeah.
We'll find out.
Yep.
To be decided, but a whole new roller coaster once you start putting your work out there and getting feedback, and comparison is the thief of joy and all of that. So backing up a little, I'm curious, in terms of your writing, do you feel that you get connected to characters first, plot, dialogue? Is there anything that like is your entrance point for stories?
That's a good question. I think usually like I'll just think up a scene. Like I can be inspired by anything and any one like throughout my day. And I've gotten better at it at the older I've gotten as a writer, I guess. Like I'll watch a movie or I'll watch a scene and I'll go, oh, that's great. And I'm like, wouldn't it be great if I did this instead? And then from there, I'll create something. Like, so I'll start with a scene. And actually, The Countess and the Commoner, that started with a scene. That's no longer in the book, but it just from a scene. So I'll have a scene and then depending on what's happening, if it's like a high angst situation or there's an argument, and then I can pull a story around that.
That's
So,
really interesting. Are you going to release that deleted scene to your newsletter subscribers?
oh, I don't think so. It was particularly, yeah, no, maybe one day, I don't know.
Sometimes sometimes I find like, I think like, oh, this is going to be great content. And then I think by the time I put the book out, the scene no longer makes any sense because I've changed so many things. And so then it's like, well, sorry, the only person who's it's going to make sense to is me, and you're not me.
That's exactly, and that book has already gone through 2 extensive rewrites, so it couldn't fit in there even if I tried to, but we'll see. I have no.
Yeah. Who are some of your favorite authors in historical romance?
I'm very basic. My all-time hero, my one true, is Lisa Kleypas. Couldn't meet her if somebody
I
offered.
know. I'm always like, I don't want to meet my heroes.
And she is. I'm sure she's lovely, but like I would probably faint. Like I couldn't be in the same room as her. She's so. And I thought, like, for the longest time, I wasn't a part of the romance community. For a very long time, I was embarrassed by my love of romance. And I think a lot of romance readers are, because we're told from years very early that it's trashy and that they're not good and stuff like that. And then you pick up something like a Lisa Kleypas and you're like, this is, she's, her imagery is fantastic. Her atmosphere writing, she does so much research for her books that I don't want to say the romance is secondary, but like, because it never is. It's always the greatest romance of all time. But her surrounding story is so important and so informative that you feel like you learn something when you read her. And she's my end all be all. Like I aspire to write as well as she does. Again, the comparison, not supposed to do that. And I don't, but she's my number one. And
Yeah.
then oh God, I mean, I'm kind of obsessing her, so I'm definitely blanking on others. But like, I
Oh,
will
that's all
say
right.
that the first romance that I bought that I didn't like find in a library or whatever was a Julia Quinn,
Okay.
and I think it was 2 brothers. Oh, I can't. But I was like 14, and I was like, I'm gonna buy this book, and then I went through it, and it had scenes, and I was like, I'm too young for this. And I held on to it until I was like 18 and I was like, okay, I think I can manage it now. And I went back and I read it and I was like, oh, I'm obsessed. And I bought a book a week from like Walmart for like
Wow.
10 years. Like I was obsessed. But I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't tell anybody. I wrote YA fiction trying to circumnavigate, but it's where I belong. I'm very happy to
Yeah.
be in my historic romance world.
So how did you evolve from being a closeted romance reader to coming out into it?
So, well, I would read them a book a week at least. Like, and I got so good at reading them in public, like my face wouldn't change a shade at all when I got to certain parts. And my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, we were on a cruise, and he was like, "Oh, what are you reading?" I'm like, "Oh, this," and I showed him the scene, and he like closed the book. He was like, "People are around," and I was like, "Nobody can see. It's fine. It's a book. It's magic." But he was actually very supportive of it. He would like find me like old historical romances and he was like, oh, did you read this one yet? I'm like, no, thank you, thanks. And he would like bring them to me like I was a raccoon or something. And because I was so comfortable with him and my writing, and I don't know. And then I don't know, I think it might have been like Bookstagram eventually, like where there was just this community, people who knew who Lisa Kleypas was. Like I thought I was the only one in the world. And then you're like, oh no, these books are my favorite too. And I'm like, oh, I had no idea other people read them. And then they were also happy and proud. And I was like, okay, me too. Like I want to be proud too. So I am indebted to the romance community because they're so wonderfully proud. And they should be because it's all wonderful stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that story. Okay, we are going to move into Are You a Romantic?
Are you a romantic?
Which do you trust more, your heart, your gut, or your brain?
definitely all 3, but they're tiered. My gut first. Rarely does my gut send me in the wrong direction. I think maybe twice in my entire life. Like I trust my instincts.
Yeah.
And then my heart and head are equal because I can follow my heart, but I need to know situation. I need to know facts.
Yeah.
And once I know facts, then I can lead with my heart. So
All right. Do you believe in love at first sight?
absolutely not.
Okay.
Lust, I think, absolutely, 100%. You can find anybody attractive, but love is so much bigger and deeper and a lot more. So I don't know how anybody could. I'm sure it happens if it has good. I'm happy, but not for me. It took me a very long time. So
All right. Nice. Do you believe in soulmates?
I don't know if I believe in that either, just because it seems so final. Like I believe in true love, but soulmates, there's a lot of people. So maybe like soul friends, like maybe there's like a group, but one on one, I think is a real big stretch, but definitely true love. I don't know about
Okay.
soulmate.
All right. And why is romantic love important?
I think it's the most important thing because I think love is the most important thing. I've always wanted to fall in love. I was very lucky to meet my one true 20 years ago now. But it was always my end all be all. Like I've always wanted to fall in love. I love love. I love reading other people's stories. I like creating stories. I love the angst. God, I love angst so much. And I don't have any angst in my real life. We've never had any kind of drama, but reading drama is so much fun. That might be why I crave it. But yeah, romantic love is just the most exciting thing. I think I love it so much.
Yeah. It's like a magic that's added into your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you're romantic.
I am.
Matilda, I really appreciate you coming on today. Before we wrap up, where can our listeners find you and your books?
Well, you can always check out my website, www.matildamadison.com. I'm on Amazon. I'm on Barnes & Nobles for Nook and Kindle readers. The Duke Makes a Deal is going to be in paperback. It's my first paperback. So
Ooh,
that's
exciting.
available for pre-order right now. But and I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok, all under the same handles at Matilda Madison Books. And I'm on Bluesky. I don't know if anybody's on that yet, but
What is Bluesky?
I think it was like Twitter's replacement, and it was like private for a long time, and then they just opened up. And so I'm just putting my fingers on everything to see which one's gonna pop.
Yeah.
I'm around most things, but I was on Mastodon for a minute too, but I haven't checked that in a minute. So
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, I'll put these links in the show notes for everybody.
awesome.
Yeah. Thank you again. I can't wait for everyone to be able to read A Duke Makes a Deal on June 11th.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week. Check out the show notes where I put links for my guests, myself, and the podcast. Until next week, happy reading.